It's not easy to recreate an era exactly as it was. I was born in 1995, which was 5 years after the end of the 1980s, so I have little to no actual nostalgia for that era. Most of my nostalgia regarding the 1980s comes from reconstituted, regurgitated, like VH1 shows that I watched growing up that were intended for an audience 20 years my senior. But that hasn't stopped works of media such as Crossing Souls from Devolver Digital from trying to capitalize upon that 1980s nostalgia. It's not easy to recreate the 80s, but it's also incredibly easy to recreate the 80s. Now this sounds oxymoronic, because it is oxymoronic, but this is how it is. Let me just take a few seconds and go the easy route here. 1.21 gigawatts. Stay puffed, Marshmallow Man. I have Pac-Man fever. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. These are all, like, catchphrases. They have or had some meaning, and they're very easy to remember. Over the years of use and reuse and repurposing in VH1 variety shows and appearances and era-defining montages and throwback oldies stations and all that, those are the imagined 1980s. When you're defining the 1980s, you use like an Atari joystick and a Rubik's Cube and the opening riff from that Flock of Seagulls song. The opposite is nuanced, and like anything nuanced, it's a lot harder to reach, and as a result, almost everything that actively tries to find an 80s vibe falls just a little short in reality. I think Crossing Souls, unfortunately, is a little bit like that. This is a game about the 80s, but only in a superficial sense. Crossing Souls takes place in 1986, and it's a game about a group of suburban kids discovering access to an unseen dimension. This is unfortunate because in 2016 the Netflix series Stranger Things was released, a series that takes place in 1983 about a group of suburban kids discovering access to an unseen dimension. And as a result, every media piece discussing Crossing Souls references Stranger Things in some way. Mine included, I guess. Crossing Souls, for what it's worth, probably was not heavily inspired by Stranger Things, as its development began after a Kickstarter campaign in 2014. In a post-Stranger Things context, I found myself burdened in Crossing Souls with presenting the player the more nuanced version of childhood during the time period, but I think it falls short in a number of the same ways that Stranger Things does. Those superficial signposts, the Ghostbusters and Back to the Future references, the Spielberg-style music, that sort of thing, they present the imagined 80s you learn from, like, BuzzFeed quizzes. It's what's expected, but in order to stand out on a well-populated wave of 80s nostalgia, perhaps paradoxically, something new or unique needs to be presented, and there just isn't that much new about 1986 presented in Crossing Souls 1986. Now this is a shame because mechanically it both draws from history and presents something unique. Each of your characters has their own weapon, tendencies, and health bar, and you swap between them on the fly. Small puzzles can be solved by picking the best person for the job, like in Animaniacs for the Sega Genesis. But the ability to shuffle through them during combat gives each fight a sort of underlying strategy, sort of like cameo, elements of power. And the hand-drawn animation and character design does get me nostalgic, but it's less for the 80s and more for the hours of I Am Mean YouTube poop videos I watched in 2009. This is the trifecta of obscure games I had to think of today, a simple swath of the constant cacophony of, whatnot running through my mind at any given moment. Look, it is all garbage up here. There's a kind of puzzle element that works underneath, which leaves the player constantly looking inward for a solution, knowing that one of the characters must be able to do something. Perhaps Chris can hit a projectile with his baseball bat, Matt can shoot with his laser gun, Charlie can launch herself with a jump rope, Big Joe can push and pull weights, etc. And in the late game, each character needs to be used in tandem to progress. So perhaps that's actually my gripe here. For something mechanically well thought out and unique to use relatively superficial signposts and aesthetic to define this game as from the 80s is frustrating. Like, there's a lot of heart here, and a lot of substance behind that, and in context, I think it's just bad luck that Crossing Souls came out right around when we all got tired of the 1980s. Like, now there's Ready Player One, and we're all wising up to the idea that simply referencing something is not effective at creating the feeling of that something, and maybe that's more of my problem. If Crossing Souls is supposed to have this Spielberg or Zemeckis vibe to it, there could have been less direct Spielberginess or Zemeckisian... Zemeckisian... Zemeckisian, in the style of 1980s film director Robert Zemeckis. They get the details, but they miss the feeling. I don't know, that's the shame here. Crossing Souls is a fun game at its core, and if it weren't a bit tired with the references, I'd recommend it wholeheartedly. But I just can't get past my sort of boredom and malaise regarding all these retrodden 80s references.
Support us on patreon.com/Cliqist for more videos just like this, or visit us at Cliqist.com for all the latest news, reviews, investigations, interviews, and opinion pieces on indie gaming. Thank you.